we stated earlier, for almost 25 years ago, a full generation, the Oslo agreements were signed. They were based upon the application of two principles. Israel recognized the PLO as being a representative of the Palestinian people, and the Palestinians recognized the right of Israel to live in peace and security. This had been intended to pave the way for an agreement on all of the important points. This unfortunately did not happen, but they were going to cover Jerusalem, the refugees, the settlements, the security issues, borders, and relationships with neighboring countries. As you know, none of this occurred. 24 years later, we are in a situation in which even the negotiations that had been taking place between the Israelis and Palestinians have been interrupted for the past 3 years. So we can see dialogue has been broken off. This is a situation that seems to be the Israelis' desire to maintain the status quo. The status quo is quite unfortunate. The status quo since 1993, and I'll be very brief as I know that we're running late, but since 1993, there were 208,000 settlers. Now we have 670,000 settlers, or slightly more. It's not just that the numbers increased, but the increase has made it almost impossible to create a Palestinian state, has made it nearly impossible to consider the peaceful coexistence of both states. After which, we also had the creation with the wall which has led to the de facto annexation by Israel of the large block of Palestinian settlements and the largest number, the majority of the settlers in those settlements. Today, the principles have still been accepted by both, so by the Israelis and Palestinians, but we don't know what the negotiations could be based upon should they continue. The data we could discuss is elementary, and we do need to flesh that out substantially. We also do not know what the desire or wish of the populations and the Israeli and Palestinian states are, the representatives of the people and the people. And it is to answer this question that we need to look at what the people want. We need to look at what the representatives want, and that is why we're holding the round table we have here. That is the question we're going to attempt to respond to in this panel. Let me introduce the participants by alphabetical order. So next to me, I have Hala Abou-Hassira, who is the deputy head of the Palestinian representation in France, had been a Palestinian ambassador in Gabon, a graduate of ENA, and also family living in Gaza, which I'd like to point out. Next to Hala, you have Ayman Odeh, who's a member of the Knesset, and as our president would say, he's also Palestinian because he's part of the demographic minority, representing roughly 20% of the Israeli population. So what they call the Israeli Arabs, these are Palestinians who have stayed in their homes when they created the State of Israel. He is a lawyer, a member of the Israeli Bar, and Secretary General of Hadash, and a member of the Commission for Work, and that party now being the third political force of the Israeli parliament. We also have Elias Sanbar, who's been ambassador of Palestine to UNESCO since 2006, an author, historian, the translator, has been taught in Princeton, member of the Palestinian delegation for the negotiations of peace in Madrid in 1991 and in Washington. He has published some 10 books, the last one with Stéphane Hessel, Le Rescapé et l'Exilé, as well as Palestine Explained to the World, Le Seuil 2013. So alongside me, I also have Daniel Shek. Daniel Shek is a diplomat for many years, who is the ambassador of Israel and France 2006 to 2010. So under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, prior to that had been a member of the Israel delegation, the UN in New York, also Consulate General of Israel for the Pacific Northwest region. He's a translator, an instructor, and has been working within the movement and is continuing to be quite active in politics. Next to Daniel Shek, we have a Zeev Sternhell, historian, specialist in the history of fascism and nationalism and the rise of nationalism in France. He's one of the founder of the movements Peace Now in Israel. Its existence is known for his criticism of the right in Israel. He's been heavily criticized himself and also was a victim of an attack in Jerusalem. Luckily, he was escaped it, but there was an attack on him in 2008, so attributed to the Israeli far right. He is also the author of Aux origines d'Israël, published by Gallimard in 2004. Now, we're going to try and understand with the help of our panelists what both people want, desire, what their leaders want. We'll start with the viewpoint of Elias Sanbar. Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for your invitation today. I will not respond directly to that question because the question of what the players want or what the Palestinian people want or the representatives want, you have the response. You've been hearing that now for the past 26 years. And we have had time to become familiar with this. This answer has been given since 1991, since Madrid, since the endless negotiations of the past quarter of a century. Microphone, please. And you've also had a glimpse of that when you heard from the previous speakers. However, I believe that is fundamental today in the situation of a deadlock that we ask ourselves the question not of what they want, we know what that is, but what is possible to accomplish, because it is fundamental to be able to get through the tunnel today and not to collapse given the deadlock that is not budging. I'm saying it's not budging because the environment has totally splintered. I'm talking about the regional environment. All of the countries surrounding Palestine either have forms of civil war or terrifying dictatorship. In any case, we are seeing the disappearance of some of them, the disappearance of countries. We also are seeing a splintering of what we'd called the Arab Front at one point in time. Some of the previous speakers have stated to what extent the things have changed. Perhaps we need to make a distinction. When we speak about the Arabs, it's not the Arab people. It would be very unfair today to put a label on them and to hold them responsible for what their states have done. However, I can say in terms of the work that I carry out and in the place where I am, which is the multilateral sphere, I can assure you that we have not made any discoveries. We already knew a great deal about the genuine feelings of some, but what is new is that never before have some of the Arab countries started to share what they have in their hearts, or that we are bothering them with these stories. It is time to step away so that they can handle other issues they feel are more important, more serious for them. Now, these arguments, of course, are assisted by this situation. The situation is such that today any Arab country can legitimately state that given the hell that is unfolding on that territory, you can understand why I would give preference to what is happening in my country rather than what's happening in yours. So it's a very volatile situation. It is a deadlock, and not only in terms of the peace negotiations or advancing the idea of a Palestinian state that would be sovereign and independent. We also have a very dangerous idea, but that is based on very good intentions. I don't think it is a desire to do ill. We have many advocates of the Palestinian cause. We have heard that Israel, and it is true, is ravaging peace, taking all of the territories, but Israel, ultimately, without realizing it, or without being able to control it, is also creating a binational state. This is an extremely dangerous idea. Now, I heard this from Amira Haas, and I totally agree with what she said. The situation is quite dire, and you can see that those who are stealing and annexing lands are going to be creating a new Nakba like in 1948. Now, we thought that was not possible. I was one of those who thought that we couldn't have the same history repeat itself. But what has led me to change my opinion and what troubles me greatly, because we say, first of all, the Palestinians will exist. It's true, they already existed in 1948. But we'll see the balance of power play out. Most likely there'll be massacres and bloodbaths. But we were looking at what had happened in 1948 in the international arena, seeing it not happen again today, because the opinion is aware of the results of these forced displacements. And it is enough to look at a bordering country of Palestinian Syria, which is a brother country, that today, with the thousands of dead, the 17 million displaced within the country, either to refugee camps in Lebanon, in Turkey, elsewhere, and we have seen absolutely no reaction. So let's not delude ourselves. We can see the same thing could happen in Palestine. So we can see the outlook is no longer the same. And clearly, displacing populations is something that has become quite commonplace. And those who displace populations can do so with impunity and with no genuine reaction coming from what we call the international community. So this is what lies ahead. Now, I'd like to shift to another idea, the idea of two states. I am part of that generation that was 20 years old at the end of the 1960s and that had totally adhered to this idea. And this continues, my full adhesion to the idea of a democratic state, a state made up of citizens with no distinction based on their religion, their community, that there be a status of citizen with obligations and duties. I think today that this cannot immediately be applied, even though I think it would be the ideal solution. It is based on this principle that I thought and that I still think that the adoption of a formula with two states, meaning the possibility of creating a situation of neighboring states that would enable us in a second phase to have the advent of reconciliation. Now, for years, there had been negotiations. Negotiations now, even when they are successful, they haven't been successful for Palestine, but they only lead to cold countries. We've had cold wars, and this does not resolve anything. Now, moving back to the topic at hand, I think that it is a way to get things to change. If we have this formula with two states, it's not a form of resolution, but it's non-interference. Now, we can see this has become practically impossible. There are two things that we need to look at, which is what has happened in Libya. All of those are destroying the peace process today. Today, let's look in the statements, all of those who are acting and looking at the possibility of a free Palestinian state, independent state, taking shape. Now, it's not that the idea of two states is one that is distorted, but all ideas can be distorted. And I have had this problem with when I stated that the opposition could be criticized and could be opposed. Don't forget, I am for two states. And Netanyahu, when he has to speak, says, yes, yes, I'm in favor of two states. But it doesn't change anything. The wording has been distorted. But there's even worse than that, because we can have declarations that are opportunistic, politically speaking, or in bad faith. But there's even worse. Many people who speak about this formula with two states and saying it's possible never want to unfold a map and look at the reality of what is out in the field. If you look at any map today, you can see that the way that it is set out, it's impossible to see how we could set out two states, in particular that of defining borders and how they'd be established. Now, of course, people will respond in principle, but there'll be exchanges of territories. And if you look at a map, I defy anyone to explain how we'll be able to exchange territories in that context. It isn't possible. It has become a complication out in the field. And that is when we see why we have stopped repeating that time was playing against peace and not for it. It was true. The more time has gone past, the more difficult it has become, not only in terms of principles or in terms of statement of intention, but also in terms of how to make that concrete. So we're dealing with a situation in which they will continue to speak to us about the possibility of negotiating and so on and so forth. And at the same time, all of those who are preparing their new Nakba will continue. Now, to give you an example of how very complicated these borders are, when you think of the settlements, you think about buildings because you can see them. I defy anyone to give me the genuine surface area of the settlements, the unbuilt land. There are 3 places in Israel where it's impossible to have access. Of course, the nuclear power stations, the administration of assets where you have all the figures of what happened in 1948 in terms of stealing and pillage. And then the property department. Try to go to that property department and say you'd like to know who this plot of land belongs to. The number of times that Palestinian owners go out on their lands, which have not been built up, where there's nothing, they don't have a settlement there, where they've sold it, and they discover that this land already has been annexed, and they just haven't been told. So if you look carefully, the idea is not just that of the buildings in the settlements, but the fact that some reassure themselves saying many of the housing units have only been built within the existing settlements, but you have settlements to the east of Jerusalem for which the territory, the land acquired, stops at the Jordan River, so right on the edge of the West Bank. So we don't know what the surface area is of the settlements. We only know the surface area of the buildings. It's just one example to show you how complicated this all is. So we have certain situations showing where we are today. So what can we do in such a situation? There aren't many possibilities. We do have to stay, and perhaps at our meeting today, but I'm quite pleased because by what I've heard already, because we have to be clear-minded. We need to understand what's happening today. And each person has a variety of avenues that we can work on. And I think it's not just to give an example or to try and set this up as a model, but I can only speak concretely about my examples. And perhaps I can give some examples to others and give them ideas of what they can do in their domain, in the area that they work in, that they are combating in. Now, first of all, I believe that at all costs, during such difficult times, we need to try our utmost to create irreversible realities. So these are realities that, regardless of how the situation turns out, will continue to be advantageous. So with regards to the work that I've carried out, I think, for example, that the entry of Palestine at UNESCO is irreversible. The situation might remain deadlocked, but there are 2 details I'd like to explain why it's irreversible. During this very violent battle, when we were campaigning to have access to UNESCO, all of the opponents, the first of which was the United States, and unfortunately at the time, the head of foreign affairs in Europe came up with what was a completely unlawful proposal, was that if they were to accept enter as a national territory and not as a country, then they would all vote for us. Now, I tried to say UNESCO only includes member countries. Don't worry, you can vote for, we'll vote for you. You'll even be able to include World Heritage sites. And we had understood, and they had understood, what was at stake. Namely, going from the plural to the singular in terms of territories. If you say the Palestinian territories, they're inhabited by populations. If you say the Palestine territory, it is one people. So the idea in terms of self-determination does not need to be proven. It is given. And we entered as a member country. 6 months after our entry, UNESCO continues to correspond to me as being the representative of the national authority. For 6 months, I sent all of letters back saying this is the wrong title. We must break down the idea of territory. It is one territory with one people. So here we see an irreversible fact. Why do we have irreversible facts on Earth? Even in terms of procedures to open the door to let Palestine into UNESCO, we can see that there was a precedent they were trying to create. I don't think that it would be possible to ask the question of pulling out Palestine from UNESCO as a member country. Some other examples, look at the issue of World Heritage. An important one today. It is the sector that is appreciated by the countries. It gives prestige, being able to include sites on the World Heritage List. And of course, we have the historic value, the cultural value, the proof that the country is something, that it has weight, that it is a long-standing civilization. All of this is true. But there's a detail in the procedure that is fundamental in terms of irreversible realities or facts. The fact that if you want to apply, you need to be recognized as being sovereign of the location you would like to list. So Bethlehem is everything I've said about this procedure, but it is saying that Palestine is sovereign in Bethlehem. And it was the same thing for a very tiny village, which is Batir, which we listed. And the result was even more noteworthy. We have sites that, in terms of architecture, are even more important than Batir. Batir was urgent. We included this on the list of threatened sites. Why? Because it was about to be swallowed up by the wall. The fact that it was listed changed things. We were able to save a location and saying that we are sovereign there. And the last example that I will give is Hebron. And I can't give you the details of how violent it was to list this site, but we managed to list it based on two things, simple things. We're not able to include a religion on the list. We include locations, and it is on the Palestinian national territory. And it is the whole old city that is listed, that area where the mosque is located. Of course, no procedures were modified to do so. So I could give you other examples, but I believe this is what we need everywhere. But in all places, we need to look at these irreversible milestones that cannot be canceled, because I believe that we are going to be seeing the political impacts and others of these issues. Now, there's another theme that we tend to hear time and time again, perhaps in a variety of forms, and again, it is irreversible, that of recognition. It is fundamental that all of the battles being carried out today be around recognition and not simply based on the following arguments that we hear, which is right but is not sufficient. The current argument being that we need to recognize Palestine because it is fairer. Yes, this is true. But the argument that needs to be developed, and afterward you can do what you'd like, it is the following. Because you say, and we're talking about peace, if you're in favor of peace, saying something so that this peace can take place. Today, it is impossible. Not just because we have a far-right government in Israel because of the rise of fascism. It is impossible because, in principle, we have a recognized actor and one that is not. This imbalance means that the recognized actor will take its time blocking the one that is not recognized, the one that has been hindered from the beginning by this lack of recognition. So we need to carry out this battle of recognition on the theme of recognizing Palestine so we can unblock negotiations. It is the only way that we can achieve negotiations that will be genuine, because it will be taking place between two sides on an equal footing, at least legally speaking. I'm not talking about equality and military terms, etc., and that's not the issue at stake. But we cannot obtain one thing between a country that's recognized and one that isn't. One that's recognized will take advantage of that status, and that is what's happening. And as for the last point that we heard from the president, the current president, and I'm not going to comment it because due to my function, I have the obligation of measuring my words, because we can speak to Israel, of course. Nobody wants to understand that the problem with Israel is not that we're speaking to them. The problem with Israel is that they're not listening. Nobody's speaking to Israel as much as we do. It's not a question of talking to Israel. It's a question of being on an equal footing with Israel so that they listen. And it's not by doing nothing. And here I'll come back to the argument developed by our friend earlier from B'Tselem and from Al-Haq. It's not by not doing anything that you're encouraging someone who 24 hours a day is able to do something with full impunity. This is what I say very quickly. I hope I didn't go over the time allotted to me, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Merci Elias. Je passe maintenant la parole.
I'm going to leave the floor to Elias Ayman Odeh, member of the Knesset. As there are no translators, I'm going to try and do the simultaneous interpreting. Thank you very much for this important invitation. In spite of all the trends, supporting the right-wing party, this invitation is really encouraging. We come from the same city, which is Haifa. And he was, driven out of Haifa when he was 1 year old. And I was born 27 years after the Nakba. But in spite of our experiences, what we lived through is different, and we'll do everything for peace to advent. there are two trends, two camps in Israel at the moment. One which wants to expand occupation and make it deeper in Gaza, in this the West Bank, and another one which wants to expand segregation within Israel. And there is another current, another trend, which wants to put an end to the 1967 occupation and to make sure that Israel is a democratic state. We are facing a situation where Netanyahu is really the representative of the first current. I mentioned that is, segregation and occupation. And we are part of the second trend, which is, who want really the advent of a true democracy in Israel. I would like to, say things very clearly. The only possible solution today is that of the emergence of a Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state, and there is no other solution contemplable. Today, after the very lengthy negotiations where Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas has managed to define the statute of the Palestinian part of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, after the thousands of victims, after the negotiation for peace and the fact that the idea of peace has really made progress internationally speaking, after the adhesion of many powers, in this idea, it's fundamental, in spite of difficulties, it is fundamental not to yield and to give way on these principles. To resist means to resist on one's land, and the world respect those who resist on their land, the land they were born. And the world sympathy with the Palestinian people has grown with the resistance of Palestinians in their land, in the land they were born in. Whatever the significance of international solidarity, which can support what is to be done. All this support will be less than what the people themselves can do. And therefore, there are two parts in this fight. First of all, the fight of Palestinians themselves, and secondly, the fight of Israeli people themselves. And these two, parts are constantly interacting. The first Intifada was a real breakthrough with the Israeli opinion. I'm absolutely sincere as regards my position in Israel. I'm Arab, a Palestinian Arab, and a citizen of the State of Israel. And as I'm both a Palestinian Arab citizen and a citizen of the State of Israel, I have vital interest for this conflict to find a solution. Today, the Palestinian Arabs, citizen of the State of Israel, we account for 20% of the population of Israel. And we do not want to prevent this 20% to have an influence on the Israeli political life. It is very clear that the one who understood that best and understood how, what leverage we had is Netanyahu. He was head of the opposition when Rabin was prime minister. Rabin was supported by 56 members of the Knesset behind him. And we were 5 at the Knesset at the time, and our presence meant that even Rabin was more positive in his policy vis-à-vis Palestine. And at the same time, Netanyahu was shouting to everybody that the Rabin government was not legitimate because it was supported by a majority which was not fully Jewish. In 1999, Netanyahu got 44% of the votes and Barak 56%, and we made the difference. And we ousted Netanyahu. And Netanyahu understood the equation. As long as we had political leverage, it would be difficult for him to have the full powers. Because if we are fighting a legal fight, Netanyahu would have to persuade more than 65% of the Jewish or the Israeli people. If we are in a fraud fight, then he needs less percentage in order to have power, that is around 50%. This is why he increased the ceiling for having access to the Knesset so as to prevent us to have access to the Knesset. And this is why we put forward a unified list grouping together all the parties with Palestinian Israelis. And maybe some of you remember this. It's on that day that he tried to spread panic vis-à-vis Palestinian Israeli by saying that the Arabs were really going in droves to voting stations. And, the first, when there's a problem, the first accusation by Netanyahu is against the Palestinians. In public speeches, he has no bones in saying that the MPs come to the Knesset with the Islamic State flag. And this is not only racism. This is a very deliberate policy to make our presence illegitimate and to prevent us from being active in the political life. But the problem is not only Netanyahu, it's himself. The problem is the partisan or the alternating or the alternance system is a stalemate, and the Labour Party since 1977 has only been in government twice, one with Rabin and the other one with another prime minister. And in both cases, they didn't have, full Jewish majority, and because, they were supported by Palestinian MPs. And what is really paradoxical, and it's a scandal today, is that this party, which came into office thanks to the support of Palestinian members of the Knesset, this Labour Party today does not know how to make arrangements with the Netanyahu's, and doesn't stop making small arrangements with the Netanyahu. And doing this, they are making sure that nothing will change at the government level and political level. The leader of the Labour Party said there is no Palestine representative to speak to, and there is nothing in common between the Labour Party list and the Unified Arab list. And they said that settlements should be maintained, and that all those who want asylum in Israel must be evicted. With such a Labour Party, we don't need a right party. Right-wing party. And this is why we put forward a double approach so as to strengthen our list, open up our list, and we have also we're trying to make a connection with truly democratic Israeli forces. In order to produce real change in Israel, we need to be supported. But people must know that without us, we can't also achieve a change. So it's up to us, Palestinians in Israel, to know that alone we can't change the situation, but also democratic Israeli people must understand that without us they can't change the situation either. And I have received lots of claims and complaints But my biggest complaint is about the bill on the nation that Netanyahu is trying to win at the Knesset. That bill says that Israel is the exclusive country, is the country only for the Jewish people. They refused to use the word democracy in that bill. And that bill is trying to get a status of fundamental law, which is a law which is above all other laws and to which all laws are dependent on. But I'm not here to complain or to, but I just would like to tell you two very simple things. Is that, first of all, we want to continue a fight on our native land, and we want also to have a weight on reality. The fact that Netanyahu has increased the ceiling or the threshold allowing people to be member of the parliament means that we group together, and instead of being 5 MPs, now we're 13. So we are quite a significant force in parliament. Next time, we will make sure that there is a even bigger participation to the election so that we get more votes. We will connect to Israeli democratic forces, and we will be able to cut the grass under the feet of people who want to isolate us, and we will have more weight. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Hala Abou-Hassira. Thank you, René. Thank you very much, Mr. Odeh, for your intervention. It really gave me a lot of information on the situation within Israel and the fight of Palestinian Arabs in Israel. Now, to answer the main question of this round table, which is what do people want, I would like to talk about what Palestinians want. What do we want? We want freedom. This is simple. Personally, I want to go to Gaza, see my family, go back home without needing an authorization by the Israelis, and to leave my home without needing an authorization. What Palestinians want is to live in an independent country with East Jerusalem as a capital, and with a settlement of the issue of Palestine refugees without the restrictions which exist. What Israeli people want, or what the Israeli do not want today, is sovereignty, other than Israeli sovereign between the Jordan and the rest. They don't want to dismantle colonization, which is really a staunchest colonization in occupied Palestinian territory, including in East Jerusalem. What they don't want is, what the Israeli don't want is the return of refugees on the Palestine territory. Netanyahu summed up this position very well. He said, less than a state and more self-determination for Palestinians. And it is that position which was shared by its ministries. This position of the Israeli position must be an alarm for everybody, because it means that there is a continuation of occupation through the annexion of the Palestine territories. But I mean, this being frameworked or based on a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And in 1994, there is a complete stalemate and stoppage of the negotiation between the Palestinians and the reality after the Palestinian refused to free or release the Israeli prisoners detained And today, 3 years afterwards, in order to reach a solution, Mr. Trump is sort of devising the compromise of the century. But the compromise of the century, we Palestinians did it when we accepted in 1988 the Resolution 242 and the principle of creating a Palestine state based on the 1960 borders, i.e. 22% of historic Palestine. The question today is the Trump administration credible and honest? When it plays this role of earnest broker between the Palestinians and the Israeli, are they capable of finding the right compromise, the historic compromise they're talking about? The various administrations have always supported very clearly Israel. Obama, the last American president, completely withdrew from the peace process issue, allowing staunchest colonization, which doesn't allow any space for a Palestine state, and granting impunity to the Israeli state. The violation of international law by the Israeli being completely left with impunity. And now with the Trump government, we all have doubt about his intent and his ability to present what he calls the compromise of this century. It's true that he has frozen this transfer of the American embassy to Jerusalem. But today there are 27 bills for punishing the Palestinians and their leadership. The latest American decision to close down the office of the Palestine representation in Washington is boding ill of what the American administration is wanting to do. Actually, they are punishing the Palestine people and its leadership to use the most legal tool, i.e. the international bodies, and to use international law to make sure that Israel is before justice to being judged for war crime and other crimes. By proceeding in this way, the United States is actually punishing the victims instead of condemning, the guilty party and making sure that Israel is accountable. So therefore, we have doubts on America as the earnest broker, and America is disqualifying as a mediator between the two nations. And the idea that they can put forward a fair and balanced proposal for peace is really questioned by the whole of the Palestine population and Palestinian population. And it's on the basis of this general feeling and opinion that we Palestinians have committed ourselves in the in the process of reconciliation, internal reconciliation. And this is a partnership for looking after the needs of the Palestinian people, but also we want to strengthen the internal front in the Palestinian territory to face, the Netanyahu. And there are a number of factors which have made this reconciliation agreement easier. The first factor, which is also the most important, is the pressure of Palestinian people of the Palestinian street, who sees that there is no political possibility to reach a solution. The population, Palestinian population, who is have an human life day in and day out, and they're suffering this collective punishment of checkpoints and expropriation of the land, of deterioration of the land and the houses. I mean, it's been, there's been also a blockade for 10 years. It's a complete nightmare.
Essentiel d'une vie digne.
And I was in the Gaza Strip 6 months ago, and I was very surprised of the seriousness of the situation, because although I was talking to my family, it's going there that I realized that the fact that this population in the Gaza Strip has only 3 to 4 hours of electricity per day. There is no drinking water. I mean, the Gaza Strip is really deprived of drinking water. I mean, the underground sources are completely salty water. The unemployment in Gaza Strip is 40% of the working population. 70% of young people are unemployed. And today in the Gaza Strip, the 80% of the population lives thanks to international aid. The economy is completely destroyed. The sector of education and health are just destroyed. This was the first factor and the most important factor which has fostered this rapprochement between the Fatah and the Hamas. And the second factor is the relationship between the Hamas and the Fatah. In spite of funding by the Palestinian administration of health and sector, the Hamas has shown that it was completely unable to manage people's daily life and to meet the needs of the population. The third factor is the internal change within Hamas. Today, there is a new leadership in Hamas who comes from the ground. They're not people who lived abroad. They come from the street, and they are more sensitive to what's happening on the ground rather than to regional alliances. The fourth factor is connected to the third one, i.e. the support, the financial support given by Hamas, by Syria and Qatar following the Gulf crisis. Last factor is the pressure pressure by Egypt on Hamas to have a reconciliation with the Fatah. And so in the framework, a clear partnership with all the associations and Egypt being a guarantor for this agreement. What is this agreement? Well, it stipulates that the Palestinian Authority will exercise its prerogative in the Gaza Strip, and they're going to prepare the presidential and legislative elections, and also they're going to elect a new national council for the PLO, in which all Palestinian political forces will be represented. And in virtue of that agreement concluded in October last, the Palestinian Authority will be the authority in the Gaza Strip. So this reconciliation agreement is very important. Because it really has an impact on people. What are people expecting in the Gaza Strip? What they're waiting for the basic conditions for a dignified daily life. That is, electricity, water, economic condition, a job, and the reopening of the Rafah checkpoint, which has been closed until today. Now, I would like to go back to the main question of this symposium. What can France do? What can we all do in the face of this terrible reality? And it's very important to recall the historical and traditional role of France in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's important to recall that France was a pioneer and very brave country in 1981 when it was at the initiative of the declaration by the European Union, who recognized for the first time the unalienable right of Palestinian people to the right to self-determination. France, who voted in favor of a member, the status of member states in the UNESCO for Palestine. France, who voted in favor of the membership of Palestine as a member state of another organization, and also France, in the face of a political stalemate, organized an international conference for supporting the two-state solution. That was the main objective of that French initiative, that is to preserve the two-state solution. Today, there is a division. I mean, are we in favor of the two-state solution? Is it still a relevant solution? Or is it better to start a fight for only one democratic and secular state? I mean, if we ask a question to many Palestinians today, we are in favor of the two-state solution. Many people are thinking of the one single solution, thinking it's the most relevant. But I'm talking law. I'm talking right and law to sovereignty as a people. I'm talking about the right to self-determine. Only a state, a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state will provide us with this right of controlling our destiny. It's to a state independent from Israel, or at least, with self-determination. It's only with such a state that we'll be able to manage our affairs. Now, to go back to the main question, if we want to preserve the two-state solution, we have to recognize these two states. Of course, they're not going to be on equal footing, recognizing the state of Palestine. And people are going to say, yes, but if you don't recognize the Palestinian state, you'll never be on an equal footing. True. But it will support peace and will allow a true negotiation process to exist. The recognition is a must. A clear message must be sent to Israel. It's going to be it's going to put pressure to bear on Israel. And the European Union has a lot of tools to put pressure on Israel. The standards on labels coming from settlements, and many other tools are available to the member states of the European Union. Now, I'm going to conclude by talking about reconciliation. The reconciliation is in progress, but it is facing many obstacles. And in order to quash these obstacles, we need a political and financial support by the international community. And it will be a first step in trying to resume negotiations with Israel. Israel today has no excuse to flee its responsibility and to put an end to its occupation and colonial process. And the international community has no excuse either to not comply with its responsibility to help the Palestinian states. And it's about time to act with responsibility because we have no time to waste. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor immediately to Daniel Shek.
Thank you, René. Thank you for having come and listened. I need to be frank. Many of my friends, French or others, advised me against participating in this symposium for reasons, well, I will let you imagine. But I always have followed the very wise advice given to me by my father, who was a diplomat as well, unfortunately deceased from a very young age. He said quite simply, an empty chair only conveys an empty message. So leaving a seat empty does not mean much if you have something to say. And I think I do have things to say. Even if before the statement I might be hearing some very messages that could be misconstrued, perhaps even slandered, but I'm not going into detail on that. I'd like to make 3 comments. First, that if, for example, as has been presented at the beginning of our discussions this morning, you bring together a panel to perhaps take stock of the origins of the problem. I can only speak on the Israeli side. If we invite only Amira Haas and Haggai El-Ad, for both of whom I have a great deal of respect, but who themselves will also recognize that even on a day when they're particularly popular, they only represent 2 to 3% of the Jewish population of Israel. And saying afterward that they are capable or that you are capable of being able to leave this symposium with a full overview of the situation, I think that there is perhaps a certain amount of bad faith here. Likewise, asking the question of what the actors want and inviting Ayman Odeh, for whom I have the greatest admiration, honestly, one of the new politicians who is the most important of the Israeli political scene, but inviting him and another very old friend, Professor Sternhell, and your humble servant, all that we do is in any way representing the Israeli players. In our own way, we try to replace them democratically, not to represent them. So are we genuinely the right person to whom you should be asking these questions? And this goes even further, because we get the impression that this circle of friends of peace does not dare to come into contact with the other ideas, whereas honestly convincing ourselves that we're against the occupation is frankly not a tremendous challenge. And that's my second comment. We can wonder whether the fact that we're meeting together regularly here amongst friends of the peace and enemies of the occupation, because I imagine there's no point in asking that question. I think there's one single person in this room who thinks the occupation is something good or to be opposed to a peace agreement on the part of the Israelis and Palestinians. Imagine there's a certain amount of consistency in this room on this issue. So is it meaningful to come together regularly like this, as some have said, quite rightly so, to try and feed this lack of progress, or to try and take a step back when looking at reality? Because, in my opinion, to be able to try and step away from this opaque debate, we should strive also to try and step away from any preconceived ideas and from well-trodden paths, and not to be afraid of looking ahead and looking at what has changed, and to ask the legitimate question, what we have done with, of course, variations, what we define as being on the side of peace, and of course the variations here are substantial, but was it useful to one extent or to another? And third, if, as some have said, including some of our speakers this morning, if in their eyes there is no genuine difference between the right and the left in Israel, and if Avi Gabay and Naftali Bennett are the same, and if Oslo is more or less the same thing as the transfer plan, if there is no nuance, then I would ask a simple question. What do you propose we do? Are we going to wait for my friend Ayman Odeh to become the Prime Minister of Israel? Are we going to wait for a very tough stance on the part of the international community, as some have been doing for years? I have bad news for you. As Americans say, don't hold your breath. On the contrary, quite on the contrary, when we see the lack of interest for what's happening now between Israel and Palestine is growing as we speak, including in the Arab world. And it's not that I think it's a good thing, but it is a reality. And there you go. It's been said. The most important actor in this issue is reality. I am a pragmatic man. And I don't know exactly what my role should be here, but it certainly is not to speak on behalf of the current Israeli government and to present what this actor is. We can't do anything about it. It is the actor elected in Israel. Even things that I heard earlier are not going to push me so far as to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. There are limits. I am, like others in this room, opposed to the occupation. As an Israeli, I am disgusted by the very concept of these settlements, perhaps not for the same reasons as the other speakers, but with the same amount of energy, I can assure you. And I am an unfailing support. I have unfailing support for the solution of two states. I don't think there's a genuine friend of peace who would say the opposite. It's not possible. History has shown this. You cannot force two people who hate one another for decades, perhaps even for centuries, to live together in a democracy, to love each other, and then everything will be perfect. But what I am looking for are any chinks in this wall. What we have this discouraging feeling of seeing over many years. We need to innovate. We need to innovate with an eye towards a changing reality, in particular in Europe, and in particular, perhaps even more so, in the Near East. For the international community, it's a question that has been asked because it involves France, perhaps more so than others. The genuine challenge today is to be able to surmount the lack of motivation we see on the side of the Israeli and Palestinian leaders and to move forward so as not to force an agreement. The international agreement cannot want peace more than those involved. It doesn't work that way. But to find a way of being able to make that possible, perhaps even to make them want to come to the negotiating table. Now, I believe, in addition, that the people's and public opinion, to this extent, are far more mature than leaders are. And this is a phenomenon that already has been the case for some time. We also need to realize that if next year in 2018, we are going to celebrate the 60th anniversary of a single state, that of Israel, not of Palestine, that the responsibility for this failing is both sides. Both sides have made historic mistakes throughout this conflict, and it doesn't make any sense to constantly try and point to one and saying, you are more guilty than me, or he is more guilty than the other. It's all fine and well for various studies and books, etc. That's not a problem, but it does not make any sense in practical terms. What we need to do is look at the reality. Let me repeat this unfortunate word, reality, and to try and find ideas. And I will simply put one on the table. For years, I have been working within the Israel Peace Initiative, IPI. It was chosen on purpose because that is the opposite of API, the Arab Peace Initiative. So it is an organization that is coming from the civil society that would like to promote an agreement with regional dimensions. In other words, an agreement based upon both states, but in a regional context, which is what the Peace Initiative is striving towards also. I know today that this is a topic we hear about a lot. Even Donald Trump, in order to move forward the Israeli-Palestinian process, started with his first trip to Riyadh. And believe me, I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump. However, it must be said that the only initiative, well, the only movement that can be sensed in this very empty arena is the Trump administration. The only ones who seem to be interested are in the Near East. So coming back to the question of France, I think that France needs to support it, needs to find a role, a complementary role, not a competing one. That would make no sense to have competing initiatives. We need to attempt to wager on the horse that has the best chance of winning. So what is the base? And I will stop after this. This initiative for Israeli peace states first and foremost that we need to question the three founding principles here. First of all, that Israel always wanted a bilateral process, purely Israel and Palestine only. The second being that the only outside players we would accept would be the United States. And the third principle being, we would say that nothing has been concluded until everything has been concluded. And I think that as regards these three founding principles, we need to come up with alternatives, because far from me to want to question the common sense behind Oslo. I think that Oslo has contributed to the reality, the future of Israelis and Palestinians. However, if we want 3 or 4 times the same system and we realize we're running to the same wall at the same point in time, is that perhaps we need to ask ourselves some questions and try something else. And I believe that proposing a concept, a format for negotiations with 2 different schools of thought. They're not parallel because they need to intersect at some point in time. It'd be on the one side Palestine and the other Israel, other countries that are capable who would like to, and coming back to reality again. Today, it turns out that there are lots of countries like this that are willing to play a role in order to try and come up with a regional overall solution to this conflict. So having two schools of thought, two sides of this negotiation that would then be able to alleviate the fears of the Palestinians. And if we had until tomorrow morning, I'd explain how. But we have 3 minutes before I need to turn the floor over to the next speaker. Now, it is very important to state that the regional agreement is not there to skip this Palestinian step. No, I know that there are some Israeli politicians who believe that they can set aside the Palestinian issue and move straightly to making peace Mohammed bin Salam. But I don't think that this is realistic. And as an Israeli, I don't think that it is useful. For us, the Israelis, it is very important to be able to open up the doors to the region. I think that can only be beneficial to the region and to Israel. But it is vital for us to be able to find a means for being able to have the Palestinians leave. And the only way of allowing them to separate is to do this whether there'd been the Shoah or not. That the Jewish people has a fundamental right to self-determination like the other peoples. And likewise, I'm convinced that the Palestinian people has the same right. So we absolutely need to resolve this issue, but we can do so in a regional context. Now, in the overall depressed atmosphere of this room, it might seem to be a bit of wishful thinking, but unlike Amira Haas, who has promised to contribute something to the general depressed atmosphere in the room, who said clearly, I believe, on the contrary, that we always need to look for the small beam of sunlight and hope. And I think that even today, when things are going so poorly in my country for a multitude of reasons, my Haggai and Amira and friends Ayman and most likely Zeev Sternhell have merely just touched upon a few of those reasons, but things are going very badly. But we need to look for a beam of sunlight or hope so that our efforts are meaningful, and for us not merely to content ourselves with meeting together regularly in France, in Germany, in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, and elsewhere to lament the lack of hope out there. I was born in this country. My children were born in this country. My grandchildren are going to be born in this country. And I want them to be able to live in a fair country with justice, with respect for human rights. And that is why I am here, not merely to combat it, not merely to lament it. Thank you. So the floor is over to Zeev Sternhell. You have 15 minutes. Well, thank you. Well, at this late stage in our discussions this morning, I will spare you all of the material I have prepared. I would like, within the issues that we are discussing, to come back to a fundamental principle, as simple a guiding principle as possible. And this guiding principle is that the solution of two states, putting an end to the conflict, if you will, is possible, but pending one condition, namely that both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, accept the principle of the irreversibility of the situation following the independence war, the Nakba in Palestine, the Palestine disaster. Regardless of how you look at it, 1948, 1949 was the starting point and the ending point. The situation created in 1948, 1949 is irreversible. It must be irreversible. What is not accepted by the Palestinians or by the right wing in Israel? And I will point out to all of us that when we speak about the Israelis want this, the Israelis want this, they don't want this, or they don't want that. As if we're saying the French want this, the French want that. And the French, as we know, they all are very different from one another. They want many things that are not necessarily consistent. And that the far right, the right that's the left, conformist, or what have you, that all of these different mindsets all want very different things. And in our country, it's the same case. Now, unfortunately, in a democracy, and we still are a democracy, perhaps a bit of a faltering one, but a democracy that perhaps will not be perfect, but it is a democracy in which we vote, in which you put your ballot in a ballot box. Now, the elections. The upcoming elections are not very far off. They need to be won. And so we need to convince a majority that there is something that we are capable of and that the Palestinians are capable of at the same time, accepting the idea that the situation created in 49 was irreversible, which, what does that mean? What does that mean to us? We are in a country that doesn't have a constitution. We're a country of British tradition. We're a country that had been under a former British mandate. Great Britain, as everyone knows, does not have a written constitution. There are rules. There are things a gentleman does and a gentleman does not do. But what happens when we don't have gentlemen in our government? And that is what is happening today in our country. A country in which we have political and legal structures that are extremely vulnerable, because the founding fathers in 1948, 1949 did not imagine that one day there would be a minister of justice, a minister of national education, doing what is happening in our country today. The state created in 1948, 1949 was founded on two key accomplishments. First of all, the accession of the Jewish people to sovereignty, to freedom. This occurred within the framework of a state that had inherited these British structures and that had borders. The green line of 1949 which is what we call the borders of 1967, so the lines drawn in 1949, became de facto borders. De facto borders. So these need to be accepted. They are the result of this war for independence. As everybody knows here, I think, Palestine has never had political borders, ever. The historic borders that would fluctuate. Now, when at the Paris Peace Conference after World War II, maps were shown, maps that were legitimate like any other map. The north border, so the one that today is the south of Lebanon, went towards the east, all the way to the Golan Heights, all the way down to the south to the Gulf of Aqaba, going along the Rijas railroad line. In other words, the Turkish railroad, which I believe today goes through the suburbs of Haman. Now, why not? Now, afterward, these borders were changed because we had the Foreign Office PICO agreement. They discussed these borders and placed them where they are more as today. That's the Sykes-Picot agreement. There was a border, the border with Egypt, dating back to the early 20th century, no later, because Britain wanted to cover the Suez Canal and Sinai belonging to Egypt and not to Palestine. Palestine Sinai could have been given to Palestine, but in 1949 we had borders and we had a state. And we have the concept of citizenship with the birth of a state, the concept of citizens. For the first time, the Jewish people was no longer defined by their culture, their religion, their history. They're defined by their belonging to a state because they are citizens of a state. This is the foundation for the legal and political legality of the Jewish people and Arabs within the state of Israel. We are all citizens, and Daniel Shek, we are all citizens of the same state with the same ID card, the same passport, and we enjoy the same equality. Apparently, I have 5 minutes left, and I've only just begun telling you what I want to say. We are citizens of a same state, and we want to remain citizens of a same state. And we want the Arab and Jewish communities not only to have political and legal rights that are equal, but for it to be a community that will reach the level of economic equality and social equality. And I believe this is well underway. We could do much better, but I think things are not that bad. However, on the Palestinian side, my dear Palestinian friends, accept the principle of the irreversibility of the situation in 1949, and to them, it means giving up their claims, the very major claim to the right to return, so the return of the Palestinian refugees. The principle. 1949, that means that the Jewish people will not go beyond those borders, will not go beyond the Green Line to the east, and the Palestinians will not go below those limits. It isn't possible. There's no way. And nothing can bring back the Palestinian refugees today. I think we can. I think we must recognize our share of responsibility in the creation of the refugee problem. And we can and we must accept some tens of millions of refugees, the reuniting of families, coming symbolically to Israel. But we can't do more. That is the genuine stumbling block. If tomorrow a Palestinian leader, and I think that was Arafat's key failure, Arafat should have gone to the refugee camps and said, my brothers and sisters, it's over. The keys that you're keeping to your houses, keep them. Give them to your children, your grandchildren. But these houses are ones you will never be able to go back to. And we must tell our settlers, those who went on their own, those who were sent, regardless, the legal problems are not as important. The Palestinian land that those Israeli settlements on was stolen, legally or not, with judges there or not. I really don't care. And this whole issue of determining whether it was lawful or unlawful is not something I'm interested in. Whether it was legitimate, and it's not legitimate. And that is the fundamental difference, that we say to the right-wing parties in Israel that what was good and right before 1949, because it was necessary, because the Jewish people needed a roof over their heads. Perhaps only the Armenians needed a roof over their heads more than we did in the 20th century. We built our homes. 1% of the population died in 1948 to 1949, almost on the same scale as World War II. It's huge, 1% of the population. We created this state. We needed it. And the colonization of Galilee was legitimate and right. It was an existential need. Which is not the case of the occupied territories in 1967. No colony is right because it is legitimate. It's not legitimate if it is not necessary. All of the aims of Zionism were achieved with the borders of 1948-1949. All. The occupied territories in 1967 were by chance. No one had prepared for that. Nobody expected it. It happened. But that's not the matter at hand. We've been here for more than 50 years. Putting an end to colonization 100% is not possible. However, evacuating a large part of the settlements, all that are not on that green line, is possible. It's feasible and achievable. But to do this, it means being able to convince our fellow citizens that on the other side we have what we would call a partner, and Palestinians would become partners for the Israelis. On the left, on the right, the center, all. The day that they accept the principle that the situation created in 1949 was irreversible. It is only upon this foundation that we can generally move forward. All the rest, the major powers, Europeans, France, the United States, of course, let's be honest. Who is genuinely interested in this? That the Jewish and the Arabs are hurting one another. What, our friends, the Saudis? Perhaps. Egypt, with which we have excellent relations? Of course, after the military coup d'etat. But with whom? All of them, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and all that remains in the Near East, the Palestinians do not interest them. The only ones interested by the Palestinians and what happens to them, because it's also what's happening to us. It's us, the Israelis. The right wing in Israel is capable of anything. Let's not forget. When it concerns the Palestinians, and that is why the only possibility we have is the one I've just described, saying that what was done in 1949 is done, will be done forever. Thank you.
Comme vous l'avez compris, on n'aura pas le temps de...
As you've understood, we won't have the time for questions. I suggest that you should keep your questions for the end of the third session this afternoon. Thank you very much.